the forgotten Crusader hero who secured Jerusalem. History tells a simple story. It's a story of great kings and valiant knights, clad in shining steel, who rode out of Europe under the sign of the cross to reclaim Jerusalem. We all know their names: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Raymond of Taranto. They're the heroes of the First Crusade, the men whose faith and fury supposedly conquered the most sacred prize on earth. But that story? It's not the whole truth. The Holy City wasn't won by a famous warrior or a king. It wasn't taken by sword and shield alone. The final, desperate victory was made possible by a man whose name has been almost completely lost to time. A man of wood and rope, of gears and calculations. This is the story of how a brilliant engineer from Genoa held the fate of the entire crusade in his hands, and why the history books chose to forget him. By the early summer of 1099, the First Crusade was on the brink of complete collapse. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, starvation, disease, and brutal warfare across 1,000 miles, the Christian army finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem. But what should have been a moment of triumph was one of grim despair. The city was a fortress. Its massive walls were studded with towers and manned by a determined Fatimid garrison. The governor, Iftikhar al-Dawla, had prepared well. He'd expelled the local Christians, fearing they might betray the city from within, and fouled the wells and springs for miles around. The Crusader army, down to maybe just 12,000 exhausted soldiers, was now stranded in an arid wasteland under a scorching summer sun. Food was scarce, and water was even scarcer. The great lords, who had been bickering amongst themselves since they left Europe, were at a loss. They looked at the towering fortifications and knew their army was too small, too weak, and too ill-equipped to take them. They had no siege engines and, critically, no wood to build them. The governor had made sure of that, stripping the land of every last tree. On June 13th, driven by pure desperation, they tried a direct assault. It was a complete disaster. With little more than a single ladder, the knights threw themselves at the walls and were easily repulsed. Morale hit rock bottom. After years of sacrifice, the Great Crusade was about to wither and die, right within sight of its final prize. Courage, it turned out, couldn't break stone walls. They needed a miracle, and that miracle wouldn't come from the heavens, but from the sea. Just as the Crusaders began to despair, news arrived from the coast. A small flotilla of ships had been spotted at the port of Jaffa. They weren't reinforcements from a king or an army from Byzantium. They were Genoese vessels, commanded by a nobleman named Guglielmo Embriaco. Embriaco, whose name translates to William the Drunkard, a nickname that didn't quite fit his sharp mind, wasn't your typical crusader. He was a product of the Republic of Genoa, a rising maritime power whose interests were as much about commerce as they were about Christ. He was a sailor, a military commander, and an engineer, a pragmatist in a war of fanatics. For Genoa, the crusade wasn't just a holy mission. It was a chance to open new trade routes and establish valuable outposts. Embriaco and his brother arrived with skilled Genoese crossbowmen, sailors, and supplies. They found the Crusader army utterly desperate. The knights couldn't take the city, and a huge Fatimid army was marching from Egypt to relieve Jerusalem. The window for a successful siege was closing fast. The problem was simple. No wood, no siege engines, no victory. It was in this moment of crisis that Guglielmo Embriaco made a decision that would change history. Embriaco's solution was both radical and brilliant. Blockaded in the port by an Egyptian squadron, he realized his ships were useless at sea. So he gave a startling order: dismantle the fleet. He commanded his men to tear apart the very vessels that had carried them across the Mediterranean, their only way home. Every plank, every beam, every nail and coil of rope was to be repurposed. They wouldn't sail home. They would carry their ships overland and use them to conquer a city. The logistical challenge was staggering. The salvaged timber had to be hauled over 30 miles through hostile, arid territory. But under the direction of Embriaco, known to his men as Caput Malai, or Mallet Head, for his stubborn determination, the Genoese engineers got to work. For nearly 3 weeks, the camp outside Jerusalem became a massive workshop. Led by Embriaco and another noble, Gaston of Bouillon, the most advanced siege weapons of the 11th century started to take shape. The Genoese, with their expertise in shipbuilding, directed the construction of 2 massive, wheeled siege towers, mobile fortresses tall enough to overlook the city walls. They also built a powerful battering ram and countless ladders. Everyone pitched in. Old men and women helped sew ox and camel hides to cover the wooden towers, protecting them from flaming arrows and Greek fire. While the hammers rang, something else happened. A priest claimed to have a vision of a deceased crusade leader who instructed the army to fast and march barefoot around the city walls, promising God would then grant them victory. On July 8th, the entire humbled army did just that, marching solemnly as the city's defenders jeered from the ramparts. This act, combined with the sight of Embriaco's rising siege engines, galvanized the Crusaders. It united the feuding nobles and gave them a renewed sense of purpose. The army now had both the spirit and the machinery for one final attack. On the night of July 14th, 1099, the assault began. In the south, Raymond of Toulouse's forces attacked, but were met with fierce resistance. The main effort was in the north, where a great siege tower, commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, but built by Genoese hands, was painstakingly rolled toward the wall. The battle was a brutal, grinding affair. The Fatimid defenders rained down rocks and fire, but the protective hides held. Slowly, the wooden behemoth drew closer. The Genoese engineers had done their job perfectly. The tower was a masterpiece, a mobile platform of death that let the Crusaders fight on equal terms with the defenders on the walls. Then, on the morning of July 15th, the moment came. A few knights, led by a man named Ludolf of Tournai, managed to cross from the tower onto the battlements. They created a foothold, fought off the defenders, and let the tower's drawbridge lower. Godfrey of Bouillon himself was one of the first across. Once that breach was made, the Crusaders were unstoppable. They swarmed the walls, opened a gate, and the rest of the army poured into Jerusalem. The city had fallen. The impossible had been achieved. And while Godfrey and his knights were the first to set foot on the walls, their boots stood firmly on a victory engineered by Guglielmo Embriaco and his men. Their ingenuity had provided the key that unlocked the Holy City. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established their new kingdom. Godfrey of Bouillon became its first ruler, famously taking the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre instead of king. The names of the great nobles, Godfrey, Raymond, Tancred, were immortalized in the chronicles of the age. They became the heroes, the righteous warriors of God. And what about Guglielmo Embriaco, the mallet head, the man who had sacrificed his fleet and provided the genius that made it all possible? He was certainly rewarded, returning to Genoa a celebrated hero with great honours. But in the grand narrative of the Crusade, his role was shrunk, reduced to a footnote. The reason is simple. He didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. The chronicles of the First Crusade were meant to be epics of chivalry and faith. A merchant sailor from a city of traders, who won through engineering and practicality, was a much less romantic figure than a holy knight. The story of dismantling ships was a tale of logistics, not divine favour, and so the men writing the histories focused on the swords, not the saws, on the nobleman, not the engineer. The story of Guglielmo Embriaco is a powerful reminder that history is more than just the tales of kings and knights. It's also the story of engineers, logisticians, and sailors. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, be sure to subscribe and follow our channel for more hidden figures of history. The capture of Jerusalem wasn't just a triumph of faith, but a masterclass in medieval engineering. It shows that great historical moments are rarely the work of a single hero. They are born from a mix of courage and desperation, piety and pragmatism, the celebrated knight and the forgotten engineer. History remembers the man who was first over the wall. It often forgets the man who built the tower that got him there.